going to read one part of this. There's another great Martinican poet and critic and theorist named Edouard Glissant. Right, talks about what I'm trying to get at. And reading this kind of messed me up in a way that was so bad that I never, I think, will ever recover. From a moment in which I read this interview with Glissant, in which literally he is riding on the Queen Mary 2 across the Atlantic Ocean, being interviewed by this great filmmaker and film critic named Moten who's in NYU. And Diawara asked him to comment on the fact that as he's crossing the ocean in the Queen Mary 2, because he was old by this time and wasn't allowed to fly anymore because of heart trouble, to sort of talk about the irony of crossing the ocean in the lap of luxury after having written so much and so many times. I'm coming to you. It's written so much and so many times about the experience of what we now call the Middle Passage. And Glissant does this amazing thing where he says, well, and I don't have it exactly right, the thing about the Middle Passage is that what it produced is what he calls the consent not to be a single being. And what I'm interested in is this capacity for consent. That what Middle Passage opens up is the capacity to exercise a capacity. And I know that sounded bad, I'll say it again. The capacity to exercise a capacity. And that capacity is the consent not to be a single being. To a mode of human existence which is not predicated in the first instance on the belief that the self comes first. Which becomes a particularly lucky way of thinking, a particularly fortunate mode of thinking, if your capacity to exercise selfhood has been so fundamentally and systematically and systemically interdicted. And then the question is, what can people who have not necessarily had their selfhood interdicted, but who have been administering the regime in which other selfhood has been interdicted, what can they learn from this consent?
I want to pass my opportunity to speak to the girl in the front. She's been like waving her hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I was on the raise before.
Speak up.
A lot of what you talk about with the DCU or the looking at the skin and not the person, you talk a lot about this against like my race, the black race. And do you consider that this is strong against other races? Maybe like I would look at a white person and only look at their skin. Do you look at this within a broad range of races? If you understand what I'm saying?
I mean, I think, well, certainly, so there's two parts to the answer, and I think they're both true, but they might seem to contradict them. And I'll go back to what Fanon said. Because Fanon said, look, the effect of epidermalization is such that it produces this sort of two-way street. That in the same way that I can be reduced to my skin, I can also reduce someone else to their skin, right? To the white to their skin. And this is why the sort of one of the most famous passages in Fanon's work in this text called Black Skins, White Mass is this kind of weird, cool sentence that he utters. Well, he doesn't utter it in English, it's in French, but the sentence is, the black man is not, period, any more than the white man. So this condition whereby epidermalization creates a situation in which the black is trapped in blackness, the white is trapped in whiteness, there's something mutual there, and Fanon is interested in disrupting that entire systemic relationship. But at the same time, you also have to acknowledge the differential at the level of power. So that if I epidermalize somebody, if I epidermalize, yeah, you know what I mean. I'm trying to say something.
Well, I mean, also, do you think that we have, with this technology, do you think that Black people have used this technology to maybe alter the way they are perceived by the white race?
I mean, again, Fanon talks about this a lot. And I'm sort of with him, I think, if I understand this text correctly, black skin, white mass especially, to put oneself in a position of trying to alter what someone thinks about you within this racial economy is already defeat. The more urgent and productive task is to disrupt the entire system through which these evaluations actually take place. But I think that there's this other thing going on that maybe Fanon was less interested in, but which I'm totally interested in. And it's not so much black people trying to make white people think differently about black people. It's about a whole bunch of rich, complex modes of alternative social life that black people, not just black people, but that black people created, which, if they are paid attention to and if they are studied, give us some models for how we might actually make the world a little bit more of a sustainable place. And that's what I'm interested in. So it's not so much about trying to make this person think differently about me, but rather, people built something, created some new modes of sociality that we need to study, because if we copy those, we might be able to do something. You ready now?
Fred, can you repeat the questions as they're asked?
Oh, I will.
One more.
I was wondering, do you think that Black people are being trained to epidermalize themselves in certain situations?
I don't know if I would. I probably would. I had to think about the word train. I know what you mean. I think about, the reason I'm uncomfortable with the word training is because I tend to think of it as a kind of, it's almost as if it's a way of refusing to acknowledge all these alternative modes of training that you could also appeal to. So that maybe there's a way in which Baby Suggs, in her sermon, is sort of saying, what I want to do is counteract that previous training. You might have been trained to hate your flesh, but I want you to love it. But what I would want to do is I would want to say that the fact that those people were already gathered there together before she spoke bespeaks the love that she was describing in a way, rather than prescribing. You see? But
I think earlier in your talk you mentioned that there was going to be some attention to poetry coming. I don't want to make you get back onto your script, but at least speaking for myself, I would very much like to hear how poetry itself might be a technology for investigating some of the possibilities that you've been describing.
No, I mean, I don't mean it like so complicated that I'm not gonna try to answer it. But it's complicated. Part of it has to do with what it is that we mean when we say violence. It seems to be like, to me, it's like one of those words that a lot of times it seems like people use it and everybody acts like they know what everybody means by it, but then you start asking some questions and it's pretty clear. And I certainly am becoming more and more, certainly there's a very literal sense in which you could say that when Fanon talks about violence in the beginning of Rachel Europe, it means armed struggle against a colonial oppressor. But there's also these moments early on in that text where he talks about the necessity for an overturn. So, and here where I get hung up on is I'm starting to really kind of work through and think hard about the simplicity. I think the overly simple distinction we make between violence and nonviolence. Another way to think about it would be the way that Martin Luther King, for instance, and also Gandhi for that matter, deeply committed to a kind of a sharp distinction between violence and militance. Or a distinction between violence and passivity. They were in other words, the violence that I'm interested in is that second part of what you said, Wilson said, a complete overturning of a structure of modernity which is in fact based upon, this structure of urban normalization. And I'm completely committed to this complete overturning. But for me, the complete overturning I'm not saying that it would never have anything to do with getting a gun and shooting somebody. I just don't want to get a gun and shoot somebody. There might be some condition under which I would do it. But the kind of violent overturning that I'm interested in turns out to have a whole lot more to do with poetry than it does with shooting somebody in the head. I actually think that this is probably true for Frank Lewis too, but